Going Deeper. I'm your host, Tazeen, and we are here on a Wednesday just for this week. And I've got a special guest for me. I got Namira.
Hi.
Namira Islam, right?
Yes.
And today's topic, we're talking about living legacies, exploring identity, really through the lens of elders and ancestors. So before we get into the topic, if you could just tell us a little bit about who you are.
Yeah, so my name is Namira. Born in Detroit, raised in Michigan, the suburbs. My parents kind of followed the pattern of white flight out to the suburbs. But, you know, I've been hopping around Michigan most of my life. So, University of Michigan Arbor for undergrad, Michigan State for law school. After passing the bar exam, I was in Flint for like about a year and a half.
Oh, you were in Flint?
I was, yeah. So I worked at Legal Services, and that's when MuslimARC started. So the Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative launched. We just celebrated our 5-year anniversary. So
can you tell us what that is?
Yes. So MuslimARC, it's a human rights education organization, and that was kind of my focus area in law school was really thinking about how do we interrupt the process of dehumanization that leads to genocide, because I was very human rights focused. Right. And so MuslimARC, we do educational workshops, we'll do trainings specifically on anti-racism education. And so with that work, we just crossed 20,000 people reached on the ground in the past 5 years, which always blows my mind. And right now we just crossed like 125 members as well. So we are a virtual organization, but right now we're also focusing on having more of a physical headquarters here in Detroit. So
that is so exciting. I'm gonna turn this one on. Can you tell us, there's so many questions I have in my mind, but before I even get into that, can you tell us what was your journey? You talked about, you know, you went to law school and then you worked in Flint. What was your journey like, you know, working and then figuring out that you want to do MuslimARC and then starting that? Right.
So, and somebody asked me this one time, and I was like, I stumbled into MuslimARC, and they're like, no. Like, you don't stumble.
You don't stumble into things that are intentional like that.
Yes. And so really, like, during law school, one of the things I was really focused on, my application essay actually for law school mentioned that I really wanted to focus on Detroit, specifically being born there. My father came to Wayne State for his master's. I really wanted to just be focused on Detroit. Right. And a lot of my experiences in undergrad, even I was tutoring after school in Detroit and just noticing some of the inequities there, and that really got me thinking about like structural racism and all these other things, the interaction between suburbs and the city and all of that. So really, what my focus in law school on, I was just obsessed with this idea of genocide and how do you prevent genocide. How do you get there? Like, how do you actually prevent it? Right. And that led to, I interned in the Hague for a summer on Bosnian war crimes, and then basically came back and was studying the human rights sector. There's a declaration on human rights education and training, which is like a very subspecialty field that I'll talk to lawyers here. They're like, what? You know? And so that really is what specifically my interest was in MuslimARC, was like, we kind of assume that anti-racism work is just learned by osmosis, right? That somehow we just pick it up to be all for human rights, but that's not true. And so that's really where it's like, you know, a lot of people, they want to be good people, they want to challenge injustice, but they don't necessarily know how. They're not aware of what's even around them, the context that's there. So we're like, okay, we're providing both from like a very beginning level to more of an advanced level of thinking like, how do we counteract white supremacy? How do we do that in a very tangible way based on our own identities? Because not all of us have the same relationship
that is
in
true.
That system. So how do we do that?
Beautiful beings. Hi, Tracy. Yeah, that's so true, because we're not going to learn it through osmosis. There's no way.
And we don't have anything in our public schools. Other countries,
that's the other thing I was thinking is, where would you learn it in the public school system?
No. And that's where really like my interest was, because my last semester of law school I studied like other countries, like Germany with the Holocaust, South Africa with apartheid. Looking at these countries, like what have they done differently? The closest thing we have is Black History Month, which isn't even federally mandated. And there are no standards for like public schools that you have to teach on it. Or if you do teach on Black History Month, like what do you teach? So teachers, if they do touch it, oftentimes it is
It's just based on what
I have a dream speech, right? Like, and that's it. So there's some interesting work happening on that.
What do they do in other countries that you found?
So they have standards on like specific topics that need to be covered, specific like history that needs to be included. Here in Michigan, actually, one of my mentors, like after I was able to give my research off to a couple of professors, and one of them who runs like the Human Rights Law Center, she actually was instrumental in getting a bill passed in Michigan that mandates there are now 8 hours required between 8th grade and high school to teach on genocide. Wow. So that's like a very tangible way to be like, okay, future generations, like how are we? You have to teach on genocide. So
yeah, because if you don't teach it in the school system, what is the likelihood of a person seeking it themselves if they're not even aware that that's something that's happening? Right.
And I mean, Twitter and Instagram, I think, have been awesome in elevating certain like educators, certain experts, people's lived experiences and talking about race. And I feel like there's so many new books that are coming out as well on like white fragility or like white supremacy. And certain writers and just thinkers, right? Yeah. And especially on Twitter, you've got so many like Black Muslim leaders who are just completely educating nonstop, right? Yeah. So I feel like there's a cool shift happening, but it's not always mainstream. And you do see certain educators who are very deliberate about including certain lesson plans, but like they're often fighting against other systems. So like in certain states, there's like a ban on even teaching on white privilege.
Really?
Or at least they're trying to pass it. I'm not sure what the latest development is on it. But yeah, in certain states, they're like, college students cannot be hearing the word white privilege. That cannot be part of the curriculum. And it's just like,
in college?
In college.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's where things are at. And I'm especially interested in kind of seeing where the U.S. can do things differently. Right. And understanding genocide and understanding structural racism in a more mainstream way.
When you're doing the education work through MuslimARC, is it through, do you do it to organizations or companies or communities? Like, who has your target been?
Yeah, so far it's been a really wide mix. So there's been like kind of third space kind of organizations across the country. There's been a lot of student orgs. That's been really exciting, working with like MSAs. Some nonprofits. Last year we actually launched the anti-racism competencies curriculum that we have, which is based on professional development. So a lot more like boards and organizations are bringing us in. We work with like community-based organizations, with law schools, just different specialty groups, and we try to really work hard to customize the content for them. So in January I was in New York at CUNY Law School, and we did like a critical anti-Islamophobia workshop with them. And that was fascinating because one, since I am a lawyer, it's like I love working with lawyers and future law students, or like future lawyers. But like just kind of getting a sense of like, these are highly educated people and they're in law school. But I mean, I kind of underestimated how much like Islam 101 they needed to even get into Islamophobia.
Wow.
To unpack it. So that has been really, like, I love working with people on the ground because it really just gives you a good sense of, like, where are we all at? Like, where do we need to start? What's kind of going on?
Well, the first time I had an interaction with MuslimARC was when I took the anti-racism trainings that you guys were doing. And I think it was a series of 6 of them. I didn't make it to all 6. I think I made it to most of them, though. But I thought it was really amazing because there were so many different types of people that came from the community, and I felt like there were actual conversations that were taking place where people were being honest. Being honest and being open and actually listening.
We really try to emphasize, like, I'll go in and talk about, like, the ground rules that we set for the space, and I'll be like, listen, this is an artificial space, like, let's just embrace it. This is not real life. But at the same time, we're talking about our experiences, and we're just going to approach this conversation from that perspective, getting to know one another, getting to know ourselves, exploring our own identities, and then from there exploring this topic of like structural change. So it is really, I'm just always appreciative of how people bring their full selves into our spaces. And I mean, we started out very strongly focused on like within Muslim spaces, how does anti-blackness show up, all of these things, and then slowly like we started getting more and more requests from like non-Muslims, and part of it is that we come from this Islamic frame of like 4913 of getting to know one another, because we are creating nations and tribes, and that resonates for all of humankind. And it's not just necessarily even about Muslims. So that's been really fascinating just to see that, you know, kind of shift, and then to have spaces. The race identity series is a good example. It's like half and half, right? Like Muslim, non-Muslim, all kinds of ethnic backgrounds, ages, you know. So it's been really cool just to hear the conversations and learn from people.
It was definitely a really, really good series of workshops.
Thank you.
How do you feel? You're welcome. How do you feel your own identity? And we're gonna now start getting into the topic. How does your own identity, or what does your own identity play into? How does it play into you being an anti-racism educator and advocate?
Yeah, it's been a journey. I mean, in teaching about this work, one of the things that I've really come to recognize is that self-work that needs to happen and the self-awareness that needs to happen. I grew up my parents came from Bangladesh, and I grew up listening to speeches of like Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, his 1971 speech that like predated the Liberation War and all this stuff. But I think it was just interesting because my parents really emphasized Muslim identity growing up. Yeah. And so by the time I got to college, it was kind of like the U of M MSA is very South Asian Arab, right? We did have more diversity there, but it was like the cultural norms were very much around like knowing Desi culture, knowing Arab culture, and I think at that point I kind of like started not erasing certain aspects of how I grew up, but just kind of minimizing them in my own head as to like who I am. So I grew up seeing a lot of like interracial marriage, like within my family, within the Bengali community in Southeast Michigan. But by the time I got to college, people were like, oh my gosh, somebody marrying like outside of their race is this big deal. But I grew up with it being very normal. And I think like, especially, there were certain stories that like my parents didn't tell me intentionally about how the war affected them until like 2 years ago. It was this highly traumatic story that my mom had never told me. And she really emphasized the fact that they wanted us to not carry forward kind of the biases or the discrimination, and she didn't want us to just hate Pakistanis because of what happened, right? So that's been very fascinating. I mean, I can read and write Arabic, and we took the Tajweed lessons, but I can't read or write Bangla. So I'm now like trying to go back and teach myself. And then I think I'm grateful for the fact that it's like my Muslim identity was emphasized, but I also feel the other day I was having kind of like a midlife crisis, like
a quarter life
crisis, I guess. Although I'm a little bit older than I think a quarter life crisis is supposed to be at. But I was really freaking out because I'm like, wow, I feel like I have a good grasp on like my Muslim identity. I'm still teasing out some stuff around American identity. But when it comes to Bengali identity, like culturally, like I speak fluently, I understand some history, but I feel like I'm like a kindergartner in other ways, you know? And how am I going to catch up? Like I've had 30 years to know the other stuff, but how am I going to catch up on this?
I relate to that so much because I was also raised in a household that was very much about your Muslim identity, not your cultural identity. And I feel like when I was in high school and when I was in college, the Muslim, the MSA, the Muslim Student Association, was mostly immigrant kids, it was South Asians and it was Arabs. And then I was studying Arabic, so when I traveled, I was really obsessed with Arab culture, And so I feel like it took me so many years. It took me, by the time I was 24, to finally look at myself and say, well, what does it mean to be brown?
Right.
Like, what does that mean to me beyond, like, what my belief system is, but culturally? And that's a really difficult thing to go through at, like, that age.
Right? It's just like, am I too old to be having this conversation? Like, where do we even start?
Because but it's also beautiful because it's like, it's you allowing yourself to flourish and sort of blossom and learning about yourself within that process.
No, I totally agree. It is something where I've just come to embrace, because I think it's also like the older we get, the more specialized we are in certain things, so it's hard to just be like, and I'm a complete novice at this one thing. But I've definitely learned to embrace that. And I think this past February I was in Bangladesh actually and had gone, it was about 11 years later. I mean, I'd gone a couple of years back, but my aunt had just passed away. I was there for 4 days. Like, it wasn't really, I don't really count it in some ways.
So this was like an extended time that you were there.
I was there for 3 weeks, and we went to some of the memorials and some of the monuments, and I found myself also thinking about like the mono-minority myth here in the United States, especially having grown up in the suburbs, thinking about that aspect of aspirational whiteness, right? Because that's where a lot of Asians especially end up is, you know, you guys are the good minorities. You guys are the minorities that don't cause trouble, that don't protest. And then I'm in Bangladesh at these like monuments, memorials. And 1971, like, my parents' lifetime, but it's still not like that recent, you know? Right. So it's like the fact of like resistance and the way that people organized back then was still very much present in like everyday discussions. We drove through a university at one point, and on the wall there was this mural where it was like people with like raised fists, and they had like a chant. It was written in English and then in Bangla as well. And the chant said something like, you know, we will resist.
Wow.
You know, and it was just something where I'm like, this is a very like cultural norm around like fighting for what is yours, fighting around identity, around language. I was there for Ekushi February, which is February 21st, and it marks the day where protesters were shot down protesting for their language. It was one precipitating force to get to even the Liberation War. And it's like, it's a big deal, you know. People come and they put flowers down at the memorial, and it's a national day. And during the entire month, they actually have the Boy Mela, which is the book festival, which I thought was awesome. And it's actually held on the grounds, which is now a park, where Sheikh Mujibur Rahman gave his massive speech. So they actually have like a monument to where he stood that day. But on one side of the road, it was like on Taka University's campus, there were 600 stalls for all the different kinds of books. You could just walk around and just like buy books. And just like that too, like the histories of the war, certain books which I can't read fluently in Bangla, so I couldn't buy them, but the ones that were in English, just getting to explore that aspect of my identity too, where I'm like, you know, that's such an American mono-minority narrative that like Asians have never protested. And I'm like, colonial history means that we had to protest it. We kicked the British out. There was partition. There was this. There was that. You know, like, there's so much history there that isn't even taught to us. So there's this erasure and this amnesia almost around like who we are as a people. And then we settle comfortably into like middle class life here. And some of us vote Republican. And then other ones, I mean, Trump's administration, you got all kinds of, you know, Indians and South Asians as part of his leadership. You know?
So why do you think there's a difference then between people who are our age, who are raised in that society, this being normalized for them to have these, go to memorials and to celebrate this, versus people who immigrated to the U.S. and what they're carrying and passing on to their kids from that time in life?
I think so. I think there is, in the sense of comfort with disagreement. And I'll give you an example. It sounds so silly to give this story, but we were in a grocery store. We'd stopped in Taka, and right before we went to my aunt's house, and she was just picking up like random stuff, like Diet Coke and, you know, like random stuff in the refrigerator. And as we were checking out, there was a woman at the register who, I don't even know what happened, but she was like yelling. Yelling at the person at the cash register about something to do with her account and the points and membership or something. But I remember just kind of staring at her, because here, like, you just don't yell. You know, like, part of it's like, you know, the racist kind of stereotype. So if you yell, what are people gonna think about Muslims? What are people gonna think about brown people? All this other stuff. But it's also that narrative around not causing trouble, right? And like, you're just gonna have to put up with it, and almost this like turn the other cheek kind of thing. It's very Christian, you know. And that is very indicative of almost like where we kind of embrace some of the liberal talking points around like, you know, free speech is good, and we just have to, you know, agree to disagree, and reasonable disagreement, and like just kind of that narrative. I feel like people in Bangladesh that are my age are just way more comfortable with like asserting themselves, and with also this idea of like, so what, like, I will argue with you, I will fight with you, I will protest.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, even though, and I think part of it is, you know, an ethnic majority society where you're not worrying so much about what is somebody gonna say about me if I cause trouble, you know. But I do notice that difference where I came back, I'm like, why am I just like going along with things that I actually am uncomfortable with? Or, you know, like there's an element between like disagreeing, like it is trendy now to be woke, right? So it's like, you know, railing against the man is one thing, but especially talking to people within your own circles,
Yeah.
disagreeing with people in your own circles, like pushing back on things that are problematic.
Right.
That can be a lot harder for people to do. And I feel like there's a lack of openness around that that is very American. You know, talking about race is all fraught, you know, and it's a very American norm.
A lack of openness.
Yeah.
I was thinking that today, actually, because I walked in, there were like 2 coworkers who were talking in the mailroom. And I felt like it felt like such a fake conversation. Like there was such a formality.
Oh boy.
It was so thick in the air that you could just like cut right through it. And it made me think that it's such an American, but also a white American part of culture.
Very white. Yep. Very white.
Okay, well, why do we have to talk in this floral, theatrical way? Like, why can't we just be straightforward?
Right. And then let people kind of figure out their own... I mean, it's issues of fragility, right?
Yeah.
And I think the more that I've been working with people who are non-white, but also not black, the more you see aspects of that, too.
Yeah.
Where it's like, yeah, there's white fragility, but obviously for groups that are trying to aspire into whiteness, they've also internalized aspects of white fragility, right? And that has always taken me back, where I'm like, why is this messing up your entire sense of self-worth to have this conversation? Like, for real? You know, like, let's talk. This doesn't need to be this, like, massively... Not that there's anything wrong with the emotion around it, but the defensiveness, the hostility, the, hey, I'm going to punish you for bringing this up. That part of it. I'm just like, why? You know, this doesn't make sense to me. There's a problem. Let's just admit that there's a problem. Let's figure out how to fix it.
Yeah.
Done.
Let's just admit it.
Yeah.
And acknowledge it. When you came back from Bangladesh, did you have any or even when you were there, did you have any conversations with elders in your community, including your mom, your aunts, or even people who are older, about those differences? And about being open?
Yeah, it's an interesting topic. Because I think one thing that this trip I did more of was to ask stories about my grandparents, for example, or stories about my aunts even when they were younger. I think the topic specifically on like differences though, like cultural differences, actually already had come up at one point, and it's been kind of tough to bring it back up because when my father passed away, like my mom was very, not quick to mention it, but kind of puzzled by like the differences in grieving. Yeah. And I was just like, what are you talking about? Like, this is just how we grieve. We don't tend to cry in front of people. You know, why are aunties coming over and just, like, hugging us and crying? Like, this is not something I want to be doing with them. And it was such, like, a different attitude toward grief that even, I remember, tripped me up. And it wasn't until I went back to Bangladesh for those 4 days when my aunt passed away. And I was just like, oh, this is how people here grieve. Is everybody comes, they fill up the house, everybody's crying, right? But they're like sharing stories, they're reading Quran, they're making dua, you know, like they're doing all these things, but it's a very communal activity. And here it's much more individualized. So that conversation has come up, certainly, but I think in general, like, little things will come up around, like, you know, this is a very American way of doing things, versus a more, like, communal style of, like, South Asian culture of doing certain things.
Well, I find that so interesting because that is so true, grief being communal versus individual.
Yes.
And I'm sure the way that you process is going to be very different if you do it, you know, either of those ways. How has that been, just grief in general? How do you feel like that relates to your identity? Is that something that changed who you were or changed how you viewed the world?
I think so. Like, I've really come to recognize all these different cultural norms around grief that are both Muslim as well as, like, South Asian, as well as Bengali. Because I feel like Bengalis, we used to joke about this a lot as kids. Like, we don't love tragedy, but there's kind of, like, a lot of, like, the most tragic stories you'll see in, like, Bollywood. Like, Devdas is, like, a Bengali written, you know, like, story. There's just, like, this, not obsession, but there's kind of this comfort with tragedy. That you'll even listen to, like, aunties almost, like, trying to out tragedy the other one. And be like, they just met, and they'll be like, you know, and then my injury from my foot, and then they'll be like, yes, my hip, you know, and it's like, we just met, you know, like, why are we, like, talking about tragedy in such, like, a comfortable way, right? And so there's kind of this, like, I mean, and I know a lot of parents who, basically non-white parents, especially mothers, would be like, you will understand when I die.
Yeah.
When I die.
Oh my God.
That's such a common thing.
All the time.
But that reference to death, right? Like, there's a very, I don't know, there's kind of this comfort with it in certain ways, which has been helpful in some ways. I do think, like, after my dad passed away, the kind of, like, the Muslim traditions around grief, like, that definitely kind of changed my perspective on things.
How so?
So when he passed away, like, the janaza was on a Tuesday. And I remember kind of that whole week, he'd been in the ICU, like, the week before he passed. And people were, like, camping out in the waiting room. And there were just, like, so many people there. And I was so annoyed with it. But at the janaza, when, like, the masjid filled up with people to pray janaza. And then the funeral, like, the burial itself, we had, like, because the roads where he's buried, like, they're not completely paved. And since it was July, like, the cars just coming one after another, the dust was just, like, the dirt was just like a cloud, right? Because there were so many cars.
Wow.
And the fact that, like, the masjid was full, his burial, that there were, like, 100, at least 100, I don't even know at this point, but dozens of people standing there just in this big crowd. I think that especially kind of hit home to be like, oh, this shows his legacy.
Right.
It shows the fact of all these lives that he touched.
Right.
It wasn't just about me.
Right.
Obviously, like, people are here to recognize that it's, like, your father, you know. But, like, that memory, now when I go back to visit his grave, like, even if it's the middle of winter, like, I'll be standing there, like, imagining the sun, imagining how bright and how warm it was. Also, like, I had friends where, you know, one friend had driven in from Ann Arbor. Her car was, like, in very bad condition, so she rarely drove out, you know, further than just work, you know. And she was there, and she was just staying next to me the whole time. Another friend, like, I turn around, and she had come in from Chicago, right? And these are, like, you know, one was white American, so not immigrant at all, and the other was second-generation immigrant. So it was this melding of cultures around grief where it's like, you show up.
Yeah.
You know, you show up, but that element of all these different cultures, we're recognizing that we all are going to pass away someday, that we're keeping that focus in mind rather than some of the pettiness that happens on a day-to-day basis. Like, that's a very kind of, to me, like, a Muslim way of looking at grief. But the reminders around grief and death as well, like, from Bengali culture, it does help keep you grounded, and it does help you appreciate who is in your life and the choices you're making. And then, like, American norms around grief, too. Like, there are some things I don't like about it, but there are some things that are nice, too. And the fact that all of these have come together, I feel like just being able to imagine, like, my friends holding my hands, standing at his grave. Like, I thought that was going to be the worst of my life. And, I was able to walk away because they were both there holding my hands, you know? And I think about that moment a lot because it'll be 4 years this summer. But it honestly, like, I don't know what I would have done, you know, if it wasn't all those people, if it wasn't my friends, like, showing up like that, and being there. And it made it a very public thing. But I know even from talking about grief and mentioning my dad, like, I've had people who are relatively, like, strangers, you know, they're more acquaintances, but I'll see them at conferences or events, I'll be like, you know, just thank you for writing about your dad. Like, you know, may Allah bless him, you know, and they'll make dua for him. But I'll be like, you know what, I thought this was going to be a very private thing, that I wasn't going to talk too much about my grief process, but I'm glad that I have. And I've connected with so many other people too, where it's like been years for them since they've lost a parent, but or somebody else who's very close to them. But being able to just have that conversation, it's like you're not alone. And as well, it's like that aspect that it's okay if you're still grieving. Grief looks different, but it's okay if you're still grieving. Because in some ways too, like, you're trying to honor your ancestors. And what does that look like? So trying not to pretend that this never happened, like, that's
and that it didn't affect you.
And that it didn't affect you. Or, like,
because it did. It naturally did. There's so many things that you brought up that were just getting wheels in my mind moving. You talked about, but one of the first things you talked about how you saw all these people at, you know, at the graveyard, and how that made you feel, or reminded you of, like, this is the legacy that your father left behind. I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about that and what that looks like, because in his lifetime, what are the things that he did that at that point you can look back and see his actual legacy in his community?
Right. That, I think, shocked me the most. Because I knew this about my dad, and I remember thinking about this like a year after he had passed away. I was getting really overwhelmed because I was working full-time, doing MuslimARC on evenings and weekends, trying to, read and like
have a social life too.
and have a social life and knowledge, get, all of this stuff. And I remember getting really stressed out and then like almost yelling at myself because I'm like, my dad, like he worked full-time. He was an engineer with GM. And then he also had a nonprofit that he was the president and founder of. That he was working on evenings and weekends. Yeah. He taught at the Sunday school. He was on the board of like organizations I'm still finding out that he was on the board of. Yeah. That I had no idea he was on the board of those organizations. Yet he never said he was stressed out. And I remember thinking about that, and then I was like, oh, he had my mom. And my mom was the one, because I was stressing out about my house being a mess. Yeah. Like my apartment at the time, not having anything in the fridge, right? Yeah. And like laundry piled up. And I was like, oh, my mom, like that's why. But it was the two of them together that I think made sure that, one, they raised 3 girls. He was eldest in his family of his siblings, so he sent back a lot of money to help raise the rest of his family. So they're all kind of, he was from like a small village. Right. And so his nonprofit is actually for orphans in the village that he grew up in, where the whole idea is that you were interrupting the cycle of poverty through education. Okay. So basically, like, they send the kids to public schools, but they pay for everything else that lets them actually be successful in school. Yeah. And he was working on that, but he was doing it with a lot of his like college friends, because he was still in touch with his like 1976 graduating class. Yeah.
My dad is as well. I think it's
right?
a very brown thing.
Yeah. We would go and we're like 76ers, like the kids. He was still in touch with them. He was working with them though. Like they were collectively working on this nonprofit. He was bringing in other community members. My parents have been here since the 80s, so they were in touch with all of these community members from Troy and Canton and all these other places. And his Sunday school stuff, like he was mentoring these kids, and he was kind of teaching them and volunteering while also being like a board member for stuff. So it was just like seeing all these different things. Like my dad never had a write-up in the newspaper. Like people didn't know his name. It's not like he was a celebrity, right? Or an activist. I don't think he would ever call himself an activist, even though he did go to anti-war protests.
But he was impacting all these people.
Yes, and that was the thing. It's like just one person's life can have so much impact on so many different people. Like that is what really blew my mind. Where I'm like, yeah, through a life, like he was very busy, you know, in the sense there was always something going on. Yeah. But like he was never really stressed, and I think part of it was because he also knew this was going toward his legacy. And that he knew he was trying to send stuff forward, not just for his lifetime.
It's so interesting as you say that, because when you're mentioning all these different things that he did or was involved in, I'm looking at you and I'm like, well, like father, like daughter, like daughter, like father, like you are also, you doing the work that you're doing is living his legacy.
I'm certainly trying. And that was something that I became much more intentional about as well, because it was something where like work-life balance, like all that stuff. But I remember thinking it was like such a shift to be like, I don't know when I'm gonna end up in a grave, right? And it could be because of a car accident, it could be something sudden, right? Yeah. There's no guarantee that I'm going to have. He was 63, and it's like there's no guarantee that I'm gonna have until 63. Yeah. So in the meantime, like, what am I doing? Like, this isn't just about like dunya comforts, is how I often talk about it with like immigrant kids especially, but it's like, yeah, we could all be focusing on that, and it's not like a bad thing given the legacies of war and all the things that parents have gone through, to be like, I just want comfort in my life, you know, and I want a good life for my kids, and that's fine. But there are these bigger issues that are more tied to like akhira, right? And that are more tied to like, what are we gonna have to answer for? Right. If we saw injustice around us and we did nothing about it, like, what are we answering for?
That music. I think about that often, because when I have these conversations in my head about what things, how much are you willing to forgive in your parents' generation, right? Especially for the lack of interest and the lack of awareness in social justice issues in this country. How much of it is us having to forgive them for, you know, they did go through war, they did go through X, Y, and Z, and they saw these things, and so they do want that comfort, and they do want that financial stability and whatnot for their children, and for their future. But then at the same time, seeing injustice every day, like you can't just turn away and say this is not happening.
Right.
And I think that's such a struggle because it plays into our identities.
Oh, absolutely.
And what our parents raised us with, if you were an immigrant kid or a child of an immigrant, and what you're aspiring towards if you're not following in that.
Right. I think at the beginning I was very harsh in some ways, because I'm like, what are we doing? Like, we're just here for, dunya comforts and we're not caring at all. And then I started thinking a little bit more, not that all of the, especially like South Asian immigrants, not all of them did live through a lot, but at the same time, many of them, if you do sit down and talk to them, have severe trauma based on like partition. Some of them who did live, or at least their parents lived through it, right? And they have these stories around having to move or having to leave behind homes and all this other stuff. And there's a lot of stories there. Then there's just the generations of people who have either grandparents who are impacted by other forms of colonialism. For Bangladesh and Pakistan too, it's like 1971. Like, there's just so much trauma there, and a lot of them do have PTSD. Like, even talking to my mom about certain stories, like, I'm very cautious about how I approach it, because I'm like, this is very traumatizing. And especially here, like, the narrative is around mono-minorities means that Asians are good at math, and that we don't need as much mental health services. And that will be fine. And it'll be fine because we're all good, right? To the point where, like, mental health hotlines don't even have, like, certain languages available. Certain Asian languages are, like, underrepresented in translation services for mental health. So from that perspective, I'm like, this conversation isn't just a one-way thing toward the parents. It is a dialogue, because some of them do actually have also a lot of wisdom around organizing and around what that looked like. They've got stories around, okay, so you do have a revolution, then what? Like, people are struggling with food, the streets are sort of, like, it's just not as romantic and glorious as the way people are like, revolution, it's like, what happens next? And they have these stories, and they've got these lessons for us, but they also have this trauma. So then how do we have, like, an intergenerational dialogue with them to help with the healing process, to help understand things? Where are they supposed to have picked up some of this analysis from? I mean, if we don't even have it here in schools, like, where are they supposed to be getting it from, right? And so from there, my approach to, like, a lot of this dialogue too is also tied to just the idea that I'm going to assume the best of somebody that they just don't know. Some people, they know, and they're actively working against kind of some of the interests, and from there, like, yep, that's a clear line on accountability and transparency needed. But for some people where they just haven't had the space to approach this issue, like, let's give them that chance to do that. Let's also recognize that there are a lot of resources that these elders have. And I've actually had this conversation with some of the Bengali aunties and uncles who have donated to MuslimARC, even though they themselves, like, I had an uncle who actually said during a meeting that he himself had never experienced racism. This is, like, a Bengali uncle, and people, even the white people in the room, were like, wait, what? Like, are you sure that you've never experienced racism? Like, you're a Muslim, you're working. And so we unpacked that for a little bit. And he kind of, we had a little discussion about, like, tokenism in his workspace, and he was kind of in this higher position and all of that. But, like, he still wrote me a check at the end, even after saying the words, I've never experienced racism. And I think that's especially where we can move away too from some of the assumptions that they're all going to be kind of antagonistic to this cause, or that they are immediately going to dismiss it. And it's not like massive changes sometimes, It's maybe just writing the check, but that's it. But it's still writing a check, and it's still thinking about these things differently. And I've had aunties, there was one time where it was like a dawat, and the aunties were talking, they were making comments, like, around colorism, essentially, and basically passing it on to another generation, because they're talking about how dark-skinned one of the girls who's trying to get married is, or something like that. And I remember I asked them, instead of just sitting there, like, kind of seething at this conversation, I just asked, I was like, did any of you experience this when you were trying to get married? And that's all I said. And it led to, like, a 45-minute discussion on how hurt they were when they were trying to get married because of, like, rejections or comments about their skin color. To the point where one of the aunties at the end was like, you know, I don't know why I'm doing this to another generation. Like, I don't know why after experiencing this myself, like, I don't know why I'm doing it again. And some of those aunties are still making these comments, right? Yeah. But some of them, like, have, because of some of these entry points to understanding their own stuff, they've been able to then talk about racism in different ways, too.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's such a good way to have that conversation, too, because it's not like, why are you saying this or whatever, but asking them if they've experienced it, and if there's no way they haven't.
There's some story. Yeah, there's some story behind why anyone believes what they believe.
Right.
And that's kind of where I tend to come in, because I'm always curious and nosy a little bit about other people's histories, where I'm like, why, like, what's behind that? Like, why did you come to that belief? Like, where did you learn that? Like, why do you believe this? And, you know, is there some bunk science behind why you're believing this? Did you read some statistics? Did you just always hear it around you? Like, where did you come up with this notion? Did you watch certain movies like growing up? Like, where did this come from? And I think that has been really interesting, because then when I do talk to some of the elders, it's like, or some of the aunties especially, like, I've had aunties come up to me, and then I become the person where they're like, did you see that police shooting? Like, this is why is America like this? Like, and they will start ranting about it. But it's because they also, like, don't understand the context sometimes. Obviously, you do have, like, when you look at, like, some of the Chinese American aunties and uncles who, like, rallied for the police officer who had shot, like, an unarmed black man. Like, they do know how to protest. Like, somebody I ran into recently at an audience was telling me, like, they, you know, we say that they're mild minorities, but they were able to use their little WhatsApp groups and stuff, and they were able to take to the streets with signs. They did that then, you know? So they do understand it. They're on the opposite side of where they need to be. Right. But, like, clearly there's a potential there to activate this group. And especially when you do have certain model minorities who have kind of achieved the American dream, like, sometimes they've got money, you know? Like, they've got money, they've got other wisdom that bring them in somehow, if possible, can really change, you know, like, change how movements are funded. Right. Change how intergenerational dialogue is happening, change how we center elders, right?
I think that's so important too, because in so many organizations, it usually does not include elders. Like, if you have a lot of advocacy organizations are young professionals to maybe in your 40s, maybe in your 50s, and then there's like this cutoff, and it's like, where are all these people, and where's all the wisdom that they have? And especially when we're talking about identity, this is people who have our histories, right? So are we connected to that history or not, and are we taking from that and implementing it, or unpacking it, you know, to understand what is it that we believe, and why is it that we believe those things? And those conversations can't happen if we don't have intergenerational spaces.
No, and there's a lot of tension, because I do think it's a very, like, there are a lot of American norms around this, because I mean, the idea of putting your grandparents in a nursing home, right? Like, even that is, like, so American in some ways. Very white American, especially. But because of this notion around elders being no longer having use to society, it's also, like, a very capitalist model, too, to be like, oh, they're done. Like, they're not working anymore. Like, what value do they have to society? Like, there's that kind of norms. And then I do often talk about, for our identities, like, the internalized xenophobia. So this idea that, like, the parents are all backwards, and, you know, they're immigrants, what do they know? And kind of this internalized notion around, like, their worth, essentially. You know, how good do they speak English? Like, that kind of stuff, right? Like, the accents, oh my gosh. Like, there's just so much of that we internalize often. And so because of that, there is automatically, like, and this is especially what I mean about, like, educational norms and things, this push to not do that conversation, to not have that. And I think looking at, you know, Black communities, looking at other Latinx communities, and looking at our own communities too, like South Asian communities, those norms are really important. And for us to be, you know, as American as possible, which usually means as white American as possible, to then throw away elders, or to assume, like, oh, they don't know how to use computers, like, what use are they gonna, you know, like, they're always grumpy, they're always this, they're always that, like, to just constantly be embracing that narrative
right.
is perpetuating like white supremacist narratives about the world,
wow.
you know?
Yeah.
And so even just the way that we're showing up in the world and showing up with each other too, like it's very important because we're interrupting white supremacy in many ways.
Right. Wow.
And just how we live, right? And I think a lot of times, like I've seen this with certain activists where it's like, you know, once we get there, once we get to a better world, then we can change how we talk to each other or how we engage with each other.
But we can do that now.
We have to do that now.
Yeah.
We have to do it now. Because otherwise, like, this is such a long-term journey that if right now we're just being so harsh with each other and just throwing people away and kind of some of the discussions, like, it's just, I'm like, we're just perpetuating this division, right?
Yeah.
And we're basically just carrying water for some of the systems that exist around us because we're doing it in our own lives. So
and it's so important to have these conversations because otherwise, like, how many people are going to realize that white supremacy is related to how we view ourselves and how we, and that impacting how we relate to people within our community.
Right, absolutely.
Right? And then not only within our community, then how do we relate to other ethnic communities around us? And how are we buying into that because of white supremacy and what that's doing, not just to every generation within our communities.
Yeah, I mean, something that really struck me was when I went to Bangladesh, like the one thing, which my cousins and my aunts were like planning all this stuff for me to do, the one thing that I asked for was to go to my grandparents' graves. And my grandfather passed away like 3 years before I was born. My grandmother passed away when I was 16. And they're both buried in like the same grave. Right. So that was like the one thing where I'm like, I just want to visit their graves. So I visited their graves for the first time. And that was my focus. Like as soon as I landed, I'm like, I'm here, like a little bit, like kind of glad that I'm not in the United States, you know, like away from all of that. Like this is much better being here, you know, like my heart is here, my elders are here, like there was this kind of narrative that even with that, I was like telling myself, I'm like, this is like me coming back, right? And my ancestors are here and all this stuff. And it was very powerful to do that. It felt like it closed like a circle that I had been kind of struggling with. But while I was there, I then got news that an elder here, who was like a mentor of mine, passed away relatively suddenly. And I remember at the moment thinking like, you know what? I'm just going to have to embrace that like my heart is in two parts of the world. I'm just gonna have to embrace it. Yeah. Like it's not that I'm gonna go one place and I'm more there. Right. Because I do have elders here, and there are people here that have been instrumental in being part of that journey of understanding things. And there's no blood relation there, but you know these are elders. You know, Jewish elders in law school. This was an African American elder, and it's like they've got these connections too to like long-standing histories of their ancestors and the lessons that they have learned, and that we were able to connect, and actually I was able to learn from them. Like that's such an American thing in a very good way. You know, where else would I get that? And so that was like this very sudden sinking in of like, you know, this whole where do I belong kind of question. It's not going to just be resolved on with a nice little bow. Like I'm just gonna have to, like I can choose to see that as a positive thing. But I've got my elders there and I've got my elders here, and it's wow, I get two places. Like
that is incredible. And I think even the concept of elders, or the concept of ancestors, I think being brown in America, I feel so cut off from that.
Yes.
And it's so like Black communities and Native communities are very, very much attached to this idea of what are my ancestors thinking about me, or am I living in the legacy of my ancestors? Right. And I feel like that's something for us to learn, and that's something that does connect us to land in other parts of the world. Right. My husband and I went to Hawaii in December, and it was so interesting having conversations with Native Hawaiians who were talking about how their identity is connected to land. Because generations of their people, or all of the generations of their people, were from that land, and how they're rooted in the soil itself, especially if you have generations of people who are buried in that soil. And it got me thinking about what land am I connected to, right? Because you can be spiritually connected to multiple lands, and many times being brown in America and being a child of an immigrant, we forget that there's land that has so many of our ancestors in it.
Right.
And how are we connected to it? And are we thinking about it? And are we thinking of visiting and paying our respects?
Right. And I think there is a notion too around like going to graves that I think Islamically, like there's such a different norm around that. Like the hadith about like visit the graves. Yeah. You know, like visit the graves, and the Prophet Islam saying that. I mean, that to me has just been, there have been so many lessons too from visiting my father's grave. Over the years, like even just the fact that every time I go, there's a new grave there. Like a new, and you know, they don't have headstones necessarily, some people do, but new plates at least. Right. And that has struck me as something I did not expect to visit his grave. And then every time there's like at least like 2 new graves, and I'm like, whoa, we are all, you know, like we are all heading here at some point. But that notion too of like the soil and the fact that he's buried there, it starts getting me thinking about like Palestine and the fact that certain graves or graveyards are just like torn up, right? By like colonial forces and all of that.
And here where you have like buildings that are built over graveyards,
over like Native American burial grounds, and like all these other things, like the disrespect, the dehumanization of those people, that it's like, we can just like take up, you know, their graves even though their ancestors are buried here. Like that has just been really like deep, you know, just in terms of that sinking in of like, what does that mean? And then going to Bangladesh, like I feel like certain people, it's very American to be like, why would you go? You know, like why would that be on your like list of things to do when you go abroad, right? But it was very important, and I think like some of the being there too, like that graveyard when we walked in, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, like he was assassinated by his own military, and his entire family was assassinated except for his 2 daughters who were in London at the time. So which this is a story I just learned. I did not grow up knowing this, but basically like the family was assassinated, and then because the military didn't want people like, you know, going to visit the graves and all this stuff, they just like mass grave just buried them all, and nobody knew where that was. But the graveyard where my grandparents are buried, they actually have like symbolic plots for them, with their names and the ages of like everybody who was killed. And even just seeing that too, like made that more real, and just the reality of like how traumatic that was, to have like a revolution and then have this leader, this prime minister, like basically assassinated, and his entire family, and it's like by your own people too. And that just really like, it sunk in different ways. And that history for me, like looking back, has been something for me to really think about the future. I find it really important to think about the context and the history behind things, to be thinking about the future. And so all of these pieces, it's like they're coming together in a puzzle that I didn't even know I was building, right? Like, it's like, oh, the puzzle's good, you know, but no, it's like all these other pieces. That was really important to thinking about legacy as well.
Right. We have a comment. You guys are really inspirational. Such important conversation being had.
Thank you.
Well, if you have any thoughts, you can share them about your own experiences with identity and with, you know, connecting to your ancestors. How has, now that I'm assuming you go then to visit the grave often, right? How has that experience affected your everyday life? Because I know you talked a little bit about like changing how you live and perspective and whatnot.
Yeah, I find myself going there. It's interesting. I often find myself going to my dad's grave at times when I am kind of overwhelmed or just like upset with the world. And it's not, I mean, before it used to be a lot because I was just missing him, right? And then the longer it goes, it's like the more healing, I guess, that's been done. And I'll miss him in different ways, but I'll go there and oftentimes will feel very, very overwhelmed when I walk in. And then it's like, I drive in, you know, and it's where he's buried too, there's like a pond there that has like a little fountain and stuff. And then I'll park and I'll go like stand there, and it is all of a sudden this clarity that happens around like the finality, you know, of what is in front of me. And I think that especially like when I leave, it's like that perspective shift. I think that it's always important, because I'm like, okay, you know, like if I'm buried here, or if I'm buried at any point, or, you know, my mom has a plot there next to him, just it ends up just reconfiguring kind of what you're focused on a day-to-day basis. It also gives you some level of resilience, I think. That some of these annoyances, some of the things that seem like the end of the world, you know, like aren't really the end of the world. And it also gives that perspective too, that like I'm not going to be able to solve everything in my lifetime. Right. And all we're doing really, there's a lot of hadith that end up coming to my mind when I stand there, and it's kind of like the hadith around planting the seed, even if the day of judgment is tomorrow, just still plant the seed. Like that comes to mind a lot. Also like focusing too on like the people that you love, right? And that you want to spend time with. I think it is also like a very capitalist notion to just like be as efficient with relationships as possible, because you're like, why am I wasting time talking to somebody, right? Like, what do I need from them? And if I get that, like, why do I need to spend more time with them? And I think that has definitely shifted for me, because before, especially the way nonprofits are run, especially the way this country, especially with lawyers, right? Like there's all of these norms around like billable hours and you know, how many clients are you meeting with and how many hours can you rack up, you know,
what's your
like
time worth.
And so because of that, I think there's been this shift to really thinking about it. And one of the things this time that really struck me too was when I landed, like the elder that passed away here, her homegoing service was the Saturday, and I landed on Thursday. And when I went, it was that same feeling of like, look at this church, right? It's like filled with people. And then that aspect too of thinking about like legacy, like the last really conversation that I had with Mama Lila, this is actually like a heart. She loved hearts. She loved having a heart on her at all times. So this is actually made out of her clothes for like kids, like cut out hearts and put pins on them for everybody who came to the service. But like the last time I saw her in person, like we spent hours, because we had been co-facilitating, she was the director of the Detroit Equity Action Lab, cohort 4, and so we had been in session together, and we were there for like 3 hours afterward, just chatting. And she was a friend of Rosa Parks, and so the fact of like, she had some stories that she was telling about Rosa Parks, like, and I remember like having to do that in my head at the time, even just thinking like, okay, it's a Saturday, like a Saturday evening, there's stuff that I could be doing. I just worked all day, right? And then I was like, no, like it's an elder. It's somebody I really highly respect, I'm learning from, who believes in me, right? And like, why am I rushing myself? I'm just gonna sit and I'm gonna like lean back and
listen to her
stories, you know? Like, this is awesome.
And enjoy myself.
Yeah.
Tazeen, you look so cute, mashallah. Aww. Thank you, Saba Auntie. This is a friend, family friend, my mom's friend.
Oh, I love that.
You can tell us what you think too, since, you know, we're talking about learning from our elders and then our identities as related to being immigrants or children of immigrants. That's so true. The amount of time that we spend, I think it's what we as Americans value, and want to give because time is our currency. Yeah. Right? So it's how much time is money. So how much are you willing to give to certain things? And you're only going to give to that which you value. Right. And I always hate when people say I'm busy, and of course I use it too, and I try to stop myself. It's not that we're busy, it's what are we prioritizing? Right. What are we actively spending more time on and other things less time on? She said I'm listening. And that's so true. So do you feel like that's something that you've been thinking more about? Because especially nonprofit work and just the work world in general, it's so busy. Like there's so many things to be doing. Right. You know, there's not a single day where you can say, okay, I've accomplished everything that I need to do. Right. You know?
Yes. For me, like it's been the shift in also like valuing certain conversations. Because I think before, like the concept of billable hours, for example, and I'm lucky because the work that I do, I get to make this shift for myself. You know, I don't have a boss who's telling me what to do. You know? And that's been really great to be able to just think about that, where I'm like, you know, certain things that we tend to dismiss as like not being work. Right. Right. Like even that notion of what's work. Certain conversations. I mean, even in organizing, the idea of like one-to-ones with somebody. Where you sit there, you learn about their story, and you talk about your story, and then think about your self-interest and their self-interest, and you know, how can you work together? I mean, there is this outcome that is about work, that's about changing things, but there's this deep personal connection that happens, and it is all about the relationships. Mama Lila used to say that like trust is built at the speed of relationships, and that is such a shift to thinking about what is even our work, and also like the notion around storytelling. That I've like really, which I love because my mom's like an excellent storyteller. So I definitely grew up in that kind of household with the stories, and aunties too in general, like mashallah, like their storytelling skills.
I'm gonna pause you on that because I want to talk more about storytelling. One can always make more time, I know, because I have spent my lifetime on charitable causes. You were talking about storytelling, aunties and storytelling.
The way they tell stories, I mean, I love listening to them, but even now, like, that's been something where before I'm kind of like, I don't need to tell that story. You know, I don't need to put this in a story format. And there is some element to this in, like, the way liberal politics work is, like, the emphasis on facts and figures and, like, storytelling also becomes like a weird commodity, right? Like the story of this person that we're not going to give the mic to them, but we're going to use their story
and then tell it from a different perspective.
Yes, yeah. So there's kind of like this weird notion that I had around what storytelling even looked like, but I think especially now, like that's been a shift over the last year, especially just thinking about time differently, thinking about relationships differently, thinking about dialogue differently. And I'm just like, you know, we tell stories and we think like, what does this have to do with the point, right? Like. But it is the point. Yeah. And it's absolutely, like, also one way to talk to elders, too. It's just, like, they have so many stories. Like, that's why I love talking to elders. And that's why I have had so many, like, mentors. Because I love hearing their stories. And sometimes that feels to people that it's not work. Or it's not somehow enriching your life. Yeah. But it is, you know. And it's certainly something that shifts the way you think about the world. And there's so many stories, and the fact that you have time to even listen to a story. Like the phrase, like, long story short, right? Like, it's like, I want to hear the long story. Like, I want to hear the long story because it's not just like, what am I getting out of the story? Like, I just want to hear the story for the sake of the story.
Well, there's power in storytelling. There's power in passing down history orally. And I think that part of dismantling white supremacy is actually listening to our own stories from our own ancestors and retelling our own stories, you know, for each community. And I think that's huge, because if we don't, we're losing parts of ourselves completely. And that generation is going to pass on. They're already starting to pass on. So who's going to have that information?
That's probably what I like grieve the most now, actually, now that it's like 4 years since my dad passed away. There were a lot of stories that I always planned on just asking him about. And just the fact that those stories are gone, like I knew that he was a teenager in the time of 1971, like that war. I knew that he might have been in India. Like, I'm not positive. And there are some stories I can get from like my mom and that side of the family, but it's still different than hearing it from himself, you know, and he never really talked about it, which I'm kind of like, there probably was some trauma there, you know, like as being a teenager during that time. And there's a lot of other stories that, like, we heard a few of them growing up, but not all of them. And without those stories, like, it was hard to also understand the context here. I remember one time, like, you know, we used to go to Hamtramck to do a lot of grocery shopping and Dearborn to get, like, halal meat and stuff growing up. And especially while we were younger, and my sisters are all close in age, so they couldn't just leave us at home by ourselves. So we would get in the car every Saturday for what felt like forever to have to go get groceries. And I remember one time we were driving back, and my mom got really excited, and she's like, wait, like, wasn't our first apartment, like, around here somewhere? Like, I think I recognize these streets. And my dad was like, yeah, it is, but we don't have time to stop there. And she was, like, really disappointed, and I was kind of like, huh, that's weird. And then a few years later, I think because he was kind of recognizing, like, the loss of roots and the loss of context, we ended up stopping in front of the building. And I remember my mom was like, wait a second, you know, like, oh, this is the building. She started telling us stories about, like, you know, this auntie lived on that floor, this auntie lived on that floor. But the reason my dad hadn't stopped there was because the building was obviously really run down. Because they had come here as recent immigrants. He was a student at the time. Like, it was not in good shape. And when we were younger, he didn't want us to see that because he didn't want us to internalize some of the stuff he had internalized around poverty, around wealth. But especially as we were getting older, he was like, no, you guys need to see that. Like, you need to see where you came from. And to understand, like, the hard work that he put in and the sacrifices he did make and where he came from. And some of those stories are really important, too, to even thinking about how we think about poverty, you know, as a moral failing. Because that's really what I think he saw it as, is like a moral failing that he lived in this place. And we shouldn't have to see it. And it's like, that wasn't a moral feeling. Like, you know,
was something that we need to see.
Yeah, it's very important.
I also think it's interesting that those stories could only be told when you were in front of the building. Yeah. And the importance of actually visiting sites.
Yeah. Because we'd heard about this apartment building. Yeah. But it's completely different to see it. Yeah. And just kind of, I mean, I think just as people, right, we're visual creatures. We like imagining things. We like seeing things. Just having that mental picture is like so important. Right. And I think it was just all the little details that, you know, like wouldn't have been captured. They would have felt some way talking about. I think that just be able to see it was very important. And my dad did tell some stories at that point around like things that happened when he was a student in Detroit and some of the hardships that they had, which we'd heard also in kind of like a humorous way from my mom at times too. Because she tells the story of how we moved out of Detroit when I was 2.5. And I guess like one day my dad came into their apartment, that building, and since it was such an old building, there were like tiny little cockroaches everywhere. And my dad saw me pick one up and try to eat it. And he was like, we're moving, you know, like, and that was part of why we like left Detroit. But like, you know, so I knew like the apartment was not in good shape, you know, but at the same time, like seeing it also, I mean, to me too, I think the thing that really struck me when I saw it, because I was a little bit older by this point, was I loved the idea that like this building, it might look run down or be run down, but like they had a relationship with each other in this building.
And memories that they
and people, like the stories about, oh, we ran upstairs because auntie was there, and then I borrowed something from her, and then I came downstairs, then I sent the food across the hall because that auntie was there. And like so-and-so watched you a lot when you were little because she was, you know, just down the hall or whatever. Like that, to me, like that community value, when you're out in the suburbs, like that's such... I think the way white supremacy we talk about it, it's just like all about what you gain from being closer to whiteness. But like whiteness has been all about stripping that sense of community and certain norms, because in exchange for access to resources and certain privileges, you are encouraged to just become white. Lack of culture, lack of language, lack of like stories, because we're all just white.
And lack of spirituality.
Yeah. And so there's a sense too of like the suburbs, like look at all the benefits, and yet like we're in these little cookie cutter houses and you don't know your neighbors, and some suburbs are certainly different, but like that's seen as a feature, instead of like a bug, you know, of the suburbs, that you can just be in your own little bubble and not care about anybody
and
around
not connected to anyone,
and not connected to anybody.
There's so much more to unpack.
Yes.
But we've reached our hour.
Yeah.
But is there any... Wow. My mind is still thinking. Are there any other last minute thoughts that you have or things that you're thinking of right now that you'd like to share?
I think the biggest thing has been around grief. Like the fact that it's okay to just feel the wide range of emotions with it. And I really have come to despise the norm around people being stuck if they're still talking about people who passed away. That concept of like, why aren't you over it yet? That, like, I think that's my biggest takeaway, has just been like, no, like, I want to hear. It tells you a lot about somebody when you ask them, like, what deaths have they experienced? Like, who have they lost? And you start hearing, like, all these stories. And it is the reality that if we are living out the legacies of our ancestors, these people are not really gone. Like, they're still, you're carrying them forward. You're now bringing them with you, And so it's like, who are you bringing with you? Like, I would like to hear that. I would like to learn that. And I'm not going to be over here like, why are you talking about somebody who passed away 30 years ago? You know, like, no, like, that's important. They're with you here in this space. And
that's an incredible way of seeing it. And I think that's so much more powerful and so much more healing.
And it's something that people have been, I think, trying to... There's been a few people in my life who have lost other people as well. And when I lost my dad, that was something that they kind of said to me, that it's like, you are his legacy and you're carrying that forward. But it took me like 3 years to really deeply internalize that, to be like, he's not really gone. And I had an Uber driver, I posted this on Facebook, but he was dropping me off and I was telling him some story that I thought was really simple about the Tajweed lessons and all this. At the end, I just was like, he passed away almost 4 years ago. And the driver he was this older Iraqi man, and he just went really quiet and then was like, my eyes are filling with tears. And I remember we were off the highway at that point, so I was like, okay, but he said, he's like, don't say that he's passed away. He's in Jannah. And he's here with you. And that reframing, like for the first time, it wasn't this immediate reaction of like, no, that's not true. Because I think for the longest time, it was like, no, he's gone, you know? Yeah. And I just really internalized that.
Wow.
And I think that perspective, like I really just appreciate everybody who gave me that perspective and gave me that reminder when he first passed, because it took some time to sink in. Yeah. But I do really feel that now. Yeah. And it's given me a different understanding and perspective around loss and around grief.
And I think it's more honest and realistic too, because you never forget the person that you lose.
Right.
They're still a part of you, and there are still things that are going to happen in your life on a day-to-day basis, and you remember them.
Right.
So why do we try to get ourselves to forget that?
Yeah. Or just like lock it away somewhere.
Yeah, or lock it away somewhere.
Yeah.
Do you have anything else you want to say in terms of MuslimARC and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, no, we're actually really excited to be launching more membership features.
Okay.
And so next week we've got our second quarter membership call. It's coming up April 10th, so next Wednesday. But we're really encouraging people, especially before Ramadan, Muslim, non-Muslim, but to sign up for membership. Membership is $15 a month right now. And we have some really exciting like programming that we're going to be launching for members. And so if people are interested, they can go to members.muslimarc, so muslimarc.org, sign up for membership. It's a really quick process.
It is.
And then we're really excited like to be launching our new membership calendar for 2019 and some other cool kind of features with that, all tied to like storytelling and getting to know one another.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to have the links for all of those on the YouTube link and the website and the Facebook and all of that, so you guys could see that. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I really appreciate it. I feel like there's so much more to unpack, but it was really great just digging a little bit deeper into those topics that affect our everyday lives.
Yeah, of course. No, I appreciate like the framing that you even have around these conversations. Like digging deeper, I think that just really provides a framework to even start with for these conversations. So I really appreciate that. Thank you.
No problem. With that, we are going to be back next week. Next week, we're going back to our regular schedule. So Tuesdays at 7. Tune in. I will see you there.